Hello, it's Grandma Karen. You know what a good stitch and a bad stitch look like now. Today we're going to learn to wind the bobbin. We will be talking about the Bernina 930. Let's talk a little about thread. We will talk more about thread in several other lessons. I found that some beginners are frustrated when they try to find the start of the thread on a new spool of thread. These two spools have a slit where the beginning of the thread is. I call it the thread tail. On the left thread, the tail is in the slit. With the right thread, I have to peel the paper label back a little to see the slit. If the slit is hard to see, use a marker to make the slit easier to find. When you take the thread off the machine to put it away, this slit is where you can park the thread tail to keep the threads from getting tangled. We will talk about other ways to find the thread tail in another lesson. Before the thread goes onto the spool pin, you may have to pierce the paper label to find the hole. You could just tear the paper off, but there is often useful information on the label, so I don't usually tear it off. Instead, I use a small pair of scissors or a metal nail file and punch a hole in the paper at each end of the spool. Spools of thread come in lots of sizes and shapes. We are going to look closely at the way thread is wound onto spools. The threads in this photo are called stacked threads. The threads form a kind of stack like a smokestack. It is wound onto the spool one row on top of the next row. The rows go up the spool and then back down the spool. Stacked spools need to spin while you are sewing. Look at this ribbon. If I pull from the side of the spool, it comes off straight. If I pull the ribbon from the top or the bottom of the spool, the ribbon begins to twist and twist with each round that it comes off. If the stacked thread is coming from the side, like this spool right here, then it is not getting twisted. It is just staying straight as it goes, and that will give you good tension. It needs to spin when it's coming off the spool. These spools have the thread round around the spool in a different way. The thread crosses over itself diagonally each time it goes around the spool. This is called cross-wound thread. The thread needs to come off the top of the spool so it doesn't twist. It is opposite from stacked thread. The thread does not spin, it just comes off the top. So why do we need to know the difference between these two kinds of thread spools? Because we need to put the spool of thread on the correct spool pin so that it unwinds the correct way. Remember that there are two different spool pins, horizontal and vertical. Some machines, like this one, have both kinds. Some machines only have a vertical and others only have a horizontal spool pin. Stacked thread goes on the vertical spool pin so it can spin around without getting twisted. For some spools, it may make a difference if the spool is spinning clockwise or counterclockwise. Follow the diagrams in your machine's guidebook. Cross-wound threads go on the horizontal spool pin so it can pull off the top of the spool. This stitch note is to help reinforce this principle. If you are having problems with bad stitches or breaking threads, try to follow this. Stacked thread does best on the vertical spool pin. Cross-wound thread does best on the horizontal spool pin. Your sewing machine has two threads. One is called the top thread, and the other is called the bobbin thread. This is a bobbin. We put thread on this bobbin, and then the bobbin goes into the bobbin case on your sewing machine. Eventually you will run out of thread and you will have to put thread on it again. You must use a Bernina bobbin. Get them from your Bernina dealer. Other bobbins may look similar, but they will not be an exact fit. Here's a stitch note to help you remember something important. It says, using the wrong bobbin in your machine can cause bad stitches, bad tension, and cause thread jams. Bernina has several types of bobbins. Your machine takes the silver bobbins. The brown arrow is pointing to your type of bobbin, the bobbin that came with your machine. The blue arrow points to the newer version of the silver bobbin. If you buy new bobbins, they will look like this. Both fit your machine perfectly. Your machine has two vertical spool pins. Your manual calls them reel holder pins. I will call them spool pins. Your machine does not have a horizontal spool pin, and we will talk about that in a few minutes. I'm putting my stacked thread here. The thread should be coming from the back of the spool, like this. Sometimes you'll put it on like that and it'll be coming from the front. Just flip it over to make sure that it's the right way. Go around the front of this pre-tension stud, going to the front of the stud and winding it to the back. In our last lesson, we learned about tension. This little pre-tension disc makes the thread going to the bobbin winder have the same amount of tightness the whole time the bobbin is winding. Lift the lid to the bobbin winder area. Lifting the lid also keeps the needle from going up and down. As you bring the thread over to the bobbin, the thread should cross over itself right here. Place the bobbin onto the bobbin winder, and then you're going to, with your hands, you're going to wrap around the thread around the middle of the empty bobbin. Wind it around clockwise direction about 4 or 5 times. Wind the tail in also. The new bobbins have a rough edge inside, which will help the thread grip the bobbin. Push the bobbin down. Turn the machine on to half speed position. It's best not to go full speed when winding a bobbin. Review the lesson 2 if you don't remember how to do this. Press the foot control to make the bobbin wind. It will stop automatically when the bobbin is all the way full. You can stop pushing on the foot control anytime you want and stop the bobbin from winding by pushing this white lever right there. If the thread is not catching onto the bobbin when you're spinning, then there's a couple things you can do. One, you can just try to hold on to this thread about right here, and it will sometimes help it catch. Or you can just wind the thread around a few more times around the bobbin. So I'm going to take this bobbin off, and right here there's a little thread cutter to cut your thread and take your bobbin off. If I tilt the machine a little, you can see that there is a diagram of the threading path right here next to the bobbin winder. Your guidebook also has photos of how to wind the bobbin. This photo is a close-up of the threading path from the vertical spool pin. I marked it with a thick marker. Maybe this will be a little easier to see. Your machine does not have a horizontal spool pin. You can put your cross-wound threads on the vertical spool pin of your machine. It may work just fine, especially for winding the bobbin. It is not ideal. If you are finding that your thread breaks or your stitches are not forming well, then try using a thread stand like one of these for your cross-wound thread spools. This simple thread stand has a loop at the top. Put your spool here, pull up your thread into the loop, and then move the stand around till it feeds smoothly into this pre-tension disc. So I just go like that, and maybe I'll have to move this, or I might have to move my stand one side to the other. This type of spool stand can be used in several different ways and can be put on its side or standing up like this. There's a metal lined hole here that I put the thread through, and now I'm going to put it through this thread guide right here. And then I'm going to put it in here around my tension disc. Now I might have to move this over to one side or the other, or put up the arm up or down so that it feeds smoothly and evenly into your pre-tension disc. Here are some photos of these two thread stands. I have drawn the thread with a marker. Maybe it's easier to see it this way. What does a well-wound bobbin look like? This top photo shows you. The thread is even from top to bottom. It looks tight. The bottom photo shows what happens if the thread is not around the pre-tension stud correctly. The thread is not stacked evenly and it is mushy on the bobbin or loose and stringy. We cannot use this kind of wound bobbin in our machines. It will make a terrible stitch. If you don't have the thread wrapped around the bobbin correctly, it may wind onto the bobbin winder spindle instead of around the bobbin. Stop winding the bobbin if you see this happening. Push the white engaging lever to the left and it will stop. Take the bobbin off and unwind the thread that is wound incorrectly. Start again. Trim off any threads that are sticking up on the bobbin or going around over the edge. They can interfere with the bobbin and can cause bad stitches. If you wind the bobbin correctly, this may not be a problem, but it is a good reminder. Here is another stitch note to help you remember. For better stitches, cut off thread tails close to the bobbin. Do not have the thread wrapping around the edge of the bobbin. It's time for your homework. Show your mentor that you can do the following. 1. Show or describe the difference between cross-wound and stacked threads. 2. Use the felt under the thread on your spool pin. If you are using cross-wound thread, use a thread stand if you have one. 3. Set your machine to half speed. 4. Properly wind the bobbin. 5. Use the thread cutter next to the bobbin winder lever to cut the thread. In our next lesson, we will learn to thread the top of the sewing machine and put the bobbin into your machine. See you next time. And here's a note for the mentor. In our next lesson, you will need thread, a bobbin with thread on it, and the sewing machine. We will learn to thread the top of the machine and learn to thread the bobbin. Having the guidebook handy will be helpful. See the mentor's note from Lesson 6 for thread recommendations. Thank you for helping someone learn to sew.